That was Detective Eric Barnes. And as you can see in that video, you see the Jeep Cherokee driving by that parking garage. I want to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder. She's a criminal defense attorney to break down some of this case. Marnie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So, look, this case had a lot of twists and turns. You've got this conspiracy at the root of it. It's a murder for hire case. We're going into the death penalty phase on Monday. What are some of the mitigating factors that the defense attorney is going to try to point to? Because this was a tough case for the defense.
Right. Well, the defense attorney really has an open place to argue mitigating factors. He can argue anything that he wants, anything he can bring in. So obviously we're going to hear about Kristopher. But as far as the facts of the case go, I think he's going to point to, he might to any issues economically that Kristopher Love was having. You know, that he did this for money and not spite and not in cold blood, but the promise of riches beyond anyone's belief, things that could have changed his life, to show that he is not this cold-blooded person. That's Ms. Delgado. Ms. Delgado had the motive, you know, and also he can point to Crystal, who got $500 to be part of this and helped really plot and plan it as well.
Definitely. And you brought up a good point. Delgado, the alleged mastermind of this whole thing. Now, she fled to Mexico, and in order to get her back into the country to face trial, the condition of extraditing her was that she would not face the death penalty. So I'm sure we'll hear about that inequity. You know, I've got Crystal Cortez pleading guilty, right. 35 years. Love's the only one with the death penalty. What do you think of that? Will that be influential?
I think it's a little bit strange, right? That the people that really mastermind this are not being held responsible in the same way as the gunman. And I think that they'll point to not just culpability for the murder, but what they're going to do is point to motivations and what really seems to be more upsetting. This cold blood, I'm jealous, you can't have my boyfriend, or someone who maybe has a lot in his background that I'm sure is going to be brought out by the defense, who has other motivations for the crime that might not make him have any future dangerousness, which I know Texas considers in determining their death penalty.
Definitely. I think we're absolutely going to see that, Marnie Joe, hitting the nail on the head there. That's what we are going to be seeing in the courtroom Monday. In the meantime, we're going to continue to break down this testimony. This is the testimony of Crystal Cortez. Now, she is the one that struck a deal with the prosecution and ultimately pled guilty to murder and a 35-year sentence. Her testimony was critical to the case. Take a look. That was Crystal Cortez on the stand in the Kristopher Love trial. She was a critical witness testifying for the prosecution in exchange for a plea deal. I'm going to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder again for your insight on this case. So, Love claimed that he was involved in robbing Hatcher, right? And the defense theory really seemed to be that her death was an unplanned result. But the defense didn't give an opening statement, didn't put on any witnesses in his defense. And, of course, we know that's a strategic decision. Do you think that that was problematic at the end of the day, or was that really the only choice?
So it's unclear at this time without seeing how the penalty phase can go. So there's a lot of reasons in doing a death penalty case that you want to do a trial even if you believe that your chances of winning are slim to none. So it absolutely, I hope that it was a strategic decision, and that's kind of what we see when we do the penalty phase. I don't love the idea of not doing an opening statement ever.
Yeah, it's difficult, but sometimes you lock yourself in, right? So those are all those strategy calls by the defense. Right. We're going to go back into the testimony in the trial. This is Detective Eric Barnes. He's going to show us the surveillance footage that of the shooting and walk us through what's on that tape. Take a look. That was Detective Eric Barnes walking us through some of the surveillance footage. Marnie Joe, I'm going to bring you back on. Whether or not this was a burglary gone bad or a planned, basically, conspiracy to commit murder, what does that matter in the context of the penalty phase of the trial?
Well, it's different aggravators can be argued. So in Texas, two of the aggravators that I believe they'll go forward on this case is whether or not the murder is committed in the course of particular felonies, robbery being one of them. So definitely the prosecution really wants to argue that aggravator if they're looking to put this man to death. That's crucial for them during the penalty phase.
Certainly, we're going to be hearing that. And again, the defense laying the foundation for that throughout the guilty phase of the trial. We do have to go to a break, but make sure to stick with us. More on the Love case after. Thank you, Anthony, for today's top crime stories. Some disturbing stories in that set. But we are going to be going back into the Love trial. Marnie Joe Snyder, criminal defense attorney, joins me here today to break this down. Now, Marnie Joe, we know the death penalty phase commences on Monday. The prosecution obviously convinced the jury in the guilt phase of the trial. Kristopher Love was convicted of capital murder. What are some of the aggravating factors you think they'll focus on in the course of the penalty phase?
Right. So it's important to remember the prosecution is limited to some of the aggravated factors that are in the law, and then they can argue some things about future dangerousness. But I think that they're going to argue that this may have been committed in the course of a robbery, and obviously they're going to argue that this is part of a murder for hire scheme, which in itself is an aggravating factor, that he is the gunman, that he did this for money, and that's part of the problem. The defense will have to argue what his circumstances were that made him so desperate for money in order to really mitigate that part of the prosecutor's argument.
Yes, and we know that the prosecutor was focused on the conspiracy element, and much of that came from Crystal Cortez, whose testimony we did watch a little earlier today. Crystal Cortez being the primary witness for the prosecution. Marnie Joe, now, obviously the jury found her to be somewhat credible given the guilty conviction, but she did strike a plea deal. Does her testimony have a question mark next to it? Because she's not facing the death penalty in this case.
I think her testimony had two question marks next to it. One was the fact that she did take a plea deal in this case. She got the offer of 35 years, and that's despite being an integral part of planning this murder. So I think that weighed with the jury, and they might still have questions in their mind about her credibility in regards to all the details. And then I think the second thing was that she told different stories, according to the prosecution, over and over again. Their argument was that she eventually came clean, and you can believe her last one. The defense often pointed to her as the person that may have really pulled the trigger. So if the defense can argue during the penalty phase that you should be worried about having equal sentences among the conspirators, they might also point to that as to say to the jury, if you have any questions about his guilt, also, you need to be careful that we don't execute this man.
Marnie Joe, that is such a great point, and I definitely think what you said about Crystal Cortez, her story changed a bunch of times, so certainly that could be something that's focused on as we continue our coverage of this trial next week. Right now, we're going to dive back into some of the testimony. This is Angelica Gordon. She is an acquaintance of the defendant and the accomplices. Take a look. That was Angelica Gordon, an acquaintance of the defendant and also the other conspirators. I'm going to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder, criminal defense attorney. Marnie Joe, so some of these witnesses, the acquaintances, the friends, they really set the stage for the relationships between the three co-conspirators. The prosecution really needed that in order to establish their theory of the case. Of course, again, the defense really trying to, almost a Hail Mary, I guess, say, well, there's a question as to whether Kristopher Love was the one who actually pulled the trigger. But does that matter in a conspiracy case? Isn't everyone equally guilty?
Well, but I think that they're planning on, or they are planning on using that later, though, to really save his life. So I think that argument had to be made, whether that makes sense to us, right now during the trial phase, or whether it's going to make more and more sense during the penalty phase. Because there, he's going to argue, if you had, maybe you didn't have beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe you had a small doubt that he was actually the gunman, are you going to let the state of Texas put him to death when the person that I say pulled the trigger is getting 35 years and seems to be just having a grand old time giving different stories? Right,
Marnie Joe, that's a great point, and brings in the next question, which a lot of our viewers have when we move into the penalty phase of the trial. How much can you really discuss the underlying case? How much is almost relitigated to a certain extent in the penalty phase?
Right. So they move into the penalty phase on Monday because they're supposed to have been preparing for it this whole time. So the reason that it's so close in time is so that the law can save some time. There can be some movement, and they don't have to relitigate everything. If there are the facts that came out of trial are the facts that the jury's allowed to consider, but now it can be argued a little bit differently, as long as it doesn't make the lawyer that's arguing it differently lose credibility with the jury.
Right, and
so
it's important to lay that foundation. Absolutely, you want to get those ideas out there as a defense attorney, along with the theme of your case, especially when your goal is to save your client's life. Right now, we're going to turn to the testimony of the medical examiner. Take a listen.
Yes.
That was Detective Eric Barnes' cross-examination. We're going to continue to watch more of that. But first, I want to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder, criminal defense attorney, to talk about this. So there was a lot of questioning by the defense attorney in this particular, in this clip that we just watched, about the timing of when the murder happened, but maybe how long Brenda Delgado had been planning this and when Love got involved. How important is that timeline for the defense, especially since Brenda Delgado, she's the alleged mastermind?
Right. Now it's going to be incredibly important because, again, it goes towards whether Kristopher Love is a cold-blooded killer, or whether, he was taken and influenced by a plan that was already in action. And it cuts both ways, because someone who hears last minute about it and has no stake in the game and is willing to pull the trigger, that can be very scary for a capital jury to decide. Or when you get involved last minute and you have these very serious things in your past that would make you more susceptible to taking on someone else's plan, that's how the defense would argue.
Certainly, and I'm sure that we're going to see a lot of that come back into play on Monday. What about Crystal Cortez? Again, we talked about her. The next clip we're going to go into focuses on the fact that Crystal Cortez had a deal, that she escaped the death penalty. She took a plea deal of 35 years, and therefore she isn't credible. What do you make of that, and will that have any role in the penalty phase of the trial?
Right. Well, I don't know that I was clear before. What I meant to say about the interaction between the trial phase and the penalty phase is that the jury can't unhear things. However, they're limited in what they can give weight to in the penalty phase. But they are not limited in what they can consider as mitigation. And so the defense is allowed to argue that certain people who are culpable, there's an inequity in the deals that they might be getting. And so here, the defense would be smart to point out, one, that Brenda Delgado isn't even facing the death penalty anymore, and that Crystal is going to serve 35 years.
Right,
which
certainly.
is a lot of time, but it's definitely a break.
Yeah, I mean, it's not death, right? So 35 years is certainly, I mean, it's not even life. So it's certainly a deal in the sense that she could have been facing much worse. And certainly the defense is going to be pointing out that inequity of the penalties of all of the co-conspirators. We're going to continue to watch the testimony of Detective Eric Barnes. This is his cross-examination. Take a look. That was the prosecution's closing argument in the Kristopher Love trial. I want to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder now. Of course, Marnie Joe, the prosecution, you get so much information as a juror, right? You hear all these witnesses. Somebody needs to really put it all together for you. The prosecution was doing that here. Do you think that this was an effective closing argument?
Yes, I mean, I think that there was a lot of evidence in this case from the prosecution. So what she's trying to do is summarize it in such a way where each witness that she goes through boosts the credibility of all the witnesses that she spoke about before. And I think that she has been able to do that effectively. And then, of course, she is also addressing things that she believes that the defense is going to bring up in their closing or harp on later on.
Certainly. And I think something that would be emphasized, I mean, and we know that the jury really cared about this point, is that phone call, that jailhouse phone call between Love and his girlfriend where he says, I should have gotten rid of the gun. What did you make of that? I mean, I know when I heard that, I thought to myself, oh, I don't know. I think we're going to see a conviction in this case.
Right. Well, Kristopher Love put forth in his statement I don't know what he intended his defense to be later, but he relied on the fact that he was saying that Crystal's really the one that had the gun. But then he puts it back in his hand right after the murder. And I think that what the prosecution is trying to harp on is that he's the one that disposed of the gun. Why would he be disposing of the gun that Crystal used? So it's just another opportunity to put that gun in Kristopher Love's hand and make him the one that pulled the trigger. And it's with his own words.
Right. And certainly that tape must have meant something to the jury. The jury asked to have it played, and then when they were deliberating, and then about 5 minutes later came back with that guilty conviction. We do need to go to a break, but make sure to stick with us. Marnie Joe, we're going to come back to you too to break down more of the Love trial. Right now, we're going to a break, but stick around. That was the defense closing argument in the Kristopher Love trial. I'm going to bring in Marnie Joe Snyder, criminal defense attorney. So obviously, we knew what the defense was going to say. They're saying the prosecution did not fulfill their burden beyond a reasonable doubt, using those words over and over and over. Did you think this was an effective close for the defense in this case?
Well, one, I think it's what they have in this case. But yeah, I mean, reminding the jury of their burden, of the burden of the prosecution here, is a big deal. And a criminal defendant, and I think you said this before, can sit there like a sack of potatoes and they have no burden of proof. And that sack of potatoes is presumed innocent unless and until the prosecution meets that burden. Presumed innocent at all times. And so they are saying that you need to look at every part of this case and think about in your gut whether they were able to convince you. Their evidence.
You make such a good point, because a lot of our viewers ask that question, well, does the defense have to do anything? And the answer is no. It's the prosecution's burden, and it fully belongs to them. So that's where we are. Obviously, Love was ultimately convicted. We know that happened yesterday, just over 2 hours took the jury to convict. Now we're moving into that death penalty phase, which is obviously the most severe punishment that a criminal defendant can face. So what do you think we should expect from the proceedings that are set to begin Monday?
Well, the law surrounding the death penalty in Texas is a little bit strange. So there are some initial burdens that the jury has before they can consider other evidence. So the prosecution has to prove their aggravating factors, what they contend are the aggravating factors, and they can only pick out of those things which are already in Texas law. Then the jury has to decide whether the defendant presents a future dangerousness to commit criminal acts of violence to society. That's the language of the statute. And if they say no, then it can end there, and they do not have to consider other mitigating factors. That is the one that they've picked, and Mr. Love gets life in prison. If they decide that he can present a future danger to society, then they have to determine whether there are enough mitigating circumstances to spare his life. But Texas law is really complicated and a little bit confusing, because the jurors at the end are going to get instruction from the judge about how to consider these things. And they're not always reminded they don't ever have to impose the death penalty. They can choose any reason that they want to spare Mr. Love's life.
Marnie Joe, that's so interesting, and thank you for bringing us through that. That is a little bit of a unique statute in Texas, yes. So we're going to be watching out for all of that as the proceedings begin on Monday. Right now, before the end of the day, we're going to watch the verdict in the Love case. Take a look. That was the guilty verdict in the Kristopher Love case, the penalty phase of the trial scheduled to start on Monday. Marnie Joe Snyder, criminal defense attorney. Well, were you surprised by the verdict after covering this case?
I really wasn't surprised. There's a lot of reasons why someone facing death would want to have a trial instead of pleading guilty, instead of taking responsibility, no matter how bad the evidence may be against him or her. And I think that it's really important chance for someone to save their own life by going to trial and testing that evidence, because, again, it is the prosecution's burden to prove every element of every crime beyond a reasonable doubt.
Certainly, and it seems as though the prosecution did not offer Love, may have not offered Love a deal taking the death penalty off the table. So certainly that was a factor, and now we will be in the proceedings on Monday where Love will face the death penalty. Marnie Joe, you're sticking around, and you're sticking around to join Aaron Keller on the Daily Debrief. You guys should stick around too. Thanks for being with me today, and have an excellent evening with Aaron Keller.